in Neagle did not merely produce an unfortunate result, it quietly rewired the operating logic of the American constitutional system. What makes the decision so enduring and so dangerous is that it altered not just a rule, but the architecture through which rules are made meaningful. It reshaped the conditions under which power is understood to arise. Before Neagle, constitutional legitimacy followed a consistent pattern. Power flowed from text through process to authority. That pattern was recursive. Each branch depended on the others to confirm its place in that sequence. The result was not perfect harmony, but mutual constraint. Neagle introduced a different logic. It treated necessity as a self-justifying reason to act, and courts as retroactive validators of that action. This shift was subtle, but it broke more than precedent. It broke pattern. Today we trace that break through triads, three-part relationships that explain how constitutional authority is supposed to work, and how Neagle fractured that structure. Together they reveal why this case was not just an anomaly, but the origin point of a self-reinforcing departure. The Constitution assumes a specific causal order: first text, then process, then authority. Article 1 authorizes Congress to legislate. Article 2 instructs the President to execute those laws. Article 3 empowers the judiciary to interpret them. Article 5 allows that allocation to be changed, but only by amendment. Nowhere does the Constitution grant power to act simply because action is needed. Necessity may affect how discretion is exercised, but it does not create discretion where none exists. The federal government is not licensed to improvise. If new needs arise, they must be addressed by statute or by amending the Constitution itself. This is more than structure. It is the system's logic of legitimacy, and it is the logic Neagle set aside. When this constitutional grammar is followed, the system sustains its own authority. Lawful power is traceable. Executive acts rest on statutory or constitutional foundations. Courts validate those acts because they emerge from a shared source. And over time, this shared orientation builds political and legal legitimacy, not from force, but from regularity. This is what the court affirmed in Ex parte Milligan. Even in emergencies, the Constitution applies. Power remains bounded not because every actor agrees, but because each accepts the necessity of tracing action back to text. This structure is not merely formal. It ensures that legitimacy is earned, not asserted. Power arises only after its legality is confirmed. Neagle changed that sequence. The facts in re Neagle are unremarkable. A federal marshal, assigned by the Attorney General to protect Justice Stephen Field, killed a man who had threatened the justice. California arrested him for murder. The federal government sought habeas relief. There was no statute authorizing the protective assignment. No law permitted the use of lethal force in that context. Yet the Supreme Court ordered the marshal's release, holding that because protection of federal officials was necessary, the power to provide it must exist. The court did not identify a grant of authority. It constructed one from perceived necessity alone. This was the inversion. Authority no longer depended on preconditions. It was derived post hoc, ratified because the court deemed the action reasonable. Necessity supplanted law. Judicial indulgence replaced process. The result was not simply expansion of executive discretion, it was the reclassification of legitimacy itself, as something that could be conferred reactively, not earned in advance. Before Neagle, the branches of government anchored themselves in a shared reference, the constitutional text. Congress legislated within enumerated bounds. Executives executed the laws they were given. Courts evaluated all of it against the same backdrop. After Neagle, that shared reference point eroded. Congress's silence became an opening, not a barrier. The executive stepped into that silence, and the judiciary, instead of demanding statutory or textual support, supplied after-the-fact legitimacy. The branches no longer checked each other, they drifted. This was not a collapse, it was a reconfiguration. What emerged was a fragmented system. Lawmaking faded into improvisation, and constitutional fidelity gave way to institutional substitution. No actor declared the change, but Neagle made the drift permissible. Originally, federal power existed only when certain conditions aligned: a textually grounded delegation, a statute, and an authorized executive action. The Constitution assumed these links were necessary. Power depended on their convergence. Neagle severed those links. Authority began to float. Power could now be justified by inference. Judicial reasoning supplied what the text did not. Executive necessity filled gaps in statutory language. And once courts accepted such rationales, the exceptions became patterns. This is how inherent or protective powers emerged, not from enumeration, but from judicial storytelling. Over time, the associations required for legitimate action, text, process, accountability, ceased to be thresholds. They became preferences. Once power floats, the Constitution becomes less a constraint and more a canvas, something to gesture toward rather than follow. The most dangerous legacy of Neagle is not doctrinal, it is structural. The decision introduced a system where each missing element of legitimacy justifies the next. No text, invoke necessity. No statute, improvise execution. No process, let the courts approve what already happened. The triadic collapse is complete. Absence excuses absence. Legitimacy emerges not from compliance, but from retroactive validation. What remains is a system divided, the appearance of legality and the reality of improvisation. The courts speak the language of the Constitution, but the source of power lies elsewhere. The Constitution made Congress the bottleneck for new federal authority. Its structure insists no significant federal power without statutory approval. If power exceeds enumerated limits, then the remedy is amendment, not assumption. Neagle collapsed that bottleneck. Congressional inaction became irrelevant. The executive acted anyway. The judiciary filled in the rationale. And Congress, faced with no crisis it could control, no action it had authorized, was reduced to observation. This is how triadic governance collapsed into a dyad. The executive moved, the judiciary responded, and the legislature disappeared. Separation of powers was not overthrown, it was sidelined. Neagle did more than change institutional dynamics. It reversed constitutional time. Originally, law preceded action. Statutes or constitutional provisions authorized officials in advance. Courts reviewed those acts after, but only to confirm that they fit within pre-existing bounds. After Neagle, action came first. Legality was supplied later, if at all. This inversion rewired the incentives. Act now, litigate later became not a mistake, but a strategy. If the courts ultimately blessed the act, the lack of authorization was forgotten. If they didn't, the damage was often already done. Today's executive state routinely operates on this basis. Programs expand first, then look for cover. Enforcement agencies push until pushed back. Legal authority becomes an exercise in retroactive framing. Youngstown is remembered as a triumph of restraint. In some ways, it was. The court rejected President Truman's seizure of steel mills, but in doing so, It adopted the very logic that Neagle had introduced. Justice Jackson's tripartite framework affirmed that presidential power varies depending on congressional posture. If Congress authorizes, the president is strong. If Congress forbids, the president is weak. But in between, when Congress has not spoken, the president may act independently. This zone of twilight enshrines the idea that power can arise from silence. It formalizes the logic of Neagle. When text and process are absent, necessity may still justify action. Youngstown did not undo Neagle. It institutionalized its logic. It tried to manage constitutional improvisation, not eliminate it. Once improvisation is legitimized, it repeats. Modern agencies often operate beyond clear statutory boundaries. Immigration raids, surveillance programs, emergency measures, they expand first, justify later. The rationale is often necessity. The validation is often inertia. Consider federal immigration enforcement. Congress has never passed a statute authorizing warrantless arrests at hospitals or courthouses. Yet agencies act as if such authority exists. States that object are told their laws are preempted, even if no federal law explicitly permits the action in question. What supports this claim of supremacy? Not text, not process, precedent, judicial habit, the echo of Neagle. Legitimacy accrues not from fidelity to law, but from the number of times law has been set aside without consequence. This is not sustainable. A constitution that cannot constrain improvisation is not a constitution. It is a suggestion. The remedy is not balancing tests or new categories of review. It is a return to sequence. Text must come first. Process must follow. Authority must be the result. Where there is no text, there is no power. Where Congress has not spoken, silence is prohibition, not permission. Necessity may urge action, but it cannot invent legality. The Neagle model must be rejected, not refined, not balanced, not cabin-bound. Rejected. Until it is, power will continue to float. Legitimacy will continue to be supplied retroactively, and constitutional authority will remain divided against itself. Restoring the original grammar of the Constitution is not an exercise in formalism. It is an act of preservation. It is the only way to ensure that authority in the American system comes from the people, through text, through process, and never by improvisation alone.